Hello. So I finished reading about 4 or 5 books, which means it is time to give you a book update on what I have been reading. Now, with the last books I recently read, I tried to aim at reading books that covered modern issues or topics that can help me understand modern issues, such as maybe the Ukraine war or energy policies or even politicians getting into office. And I also started this other habit where I wanted to read 10 pages from a self-help book because I tend to not read those books. I tend to think they're pretty poorly written or the ideas are too basic and generic. But I nevertheless started this habit of reading 10 pages from a self-help book, so I also finished a self-help book. And then I have a philosophy book that I also read. So let's get into them. So the first book is Descartes' Discourse on Method and the Meditations. Now, this is actually 2 books. Discourse on Method is the first book and Meditations is the second book, but it's so short that you might as well consider one book. So Discourse on Method is actually what it sounds like. It is an attempt at foundationalism or attempt at knowledge, doubting your own beliefs. And then he also gives his own method of knowledge once he arrives at a solid foundation. I don't think I can cover every detail inside this book, but we can go over 3 important ones. The first one obviously being the foundational doubt. Descartes has 2 ways of going about this kind of foundational doubt, both pretty popular actually. The one is he can't distinguish his dream states from his wakeful states. So whenever he's dreaming, it seems sufficiently similar to how he's awake. And so he has no way of knowing that he's actually not still dreaming. He's in a prolonged dream. And the other one is the generic brain and the bat argument. He can't know the reliability of his sense perceptions. And so for all he knows, a demon could be stimulating his brains, his nerves in his brain, and basically inducing hallucinations. He does walk back both of those arguments to some degree, but that happens, I think, in the Meditations. And we'll get to that after. Another quite interesting idea in the Discourse on Method is his kind of cogito ergo sum. He uses this thing called a transcendental argument. And the idea of a transcendental argument is that A exists, therefore B is entailed, and therefore B has to exist. So he can doubt his own experiences. Doubting presupposes thinking, and so therefore he exists. Because for him, thinking is contained inside a subject, the I. And so, that's where you get to think, therefore I am, which is an interesting idea. But then he also talks about how he can infer the existence of God from this. So he thinks that I think, therefore I am is perfect knowledge. And perfect knowledge has to be contingent on a perfect being, which is not him. And so his perfect knowledge must come from God. That's his argument. Not saying it's the best argument, but it is an interesting one. And then also the cogito ergo sum lets him establish some reliability towards his senses. He thinks that although there might not be accurate perceptions in the sense that maybe they are hallucinations, they tend to be stable and they tend to be constant and therefore they can be reliable. So they might not be correspondent to an objective real reality, but they do behave a certain way and he can have knowledge of that. And that's how he kind of gets back towards his reliability of his senses. The last idea probably worth mentioning in the Discourse on Method is his approach to knowledge, which is quite interesting. It's very similar to how Spinoza would do things, and it's kind of like you would find in analytical geometry, except rather than using axioms from math, you can use natural observations, and then those natural observations can be plotted, so to speak, against other natural laws that you have. That's quite interesting. His next book, The Meditation, has 2 ideas that are worth mentioning, because unfortunately there's a lot of overlap between these 2 books, which kind of makes it drag on a little bit. But in the Meditations, there are 2 really interesting ideas. One is this wax argument that is quasi-famous. And the idea is, if you look at wax melting, the concept of wax doesn't disappear despite the physical changes. It's wax nonetheless. And so he kind of uses this to argue for the distinctiveness of ideas versus sensations or perceptions, which I think is a kind of cool idea. And then the next thing that he argues in this book is the mind-body dualism, which is extremely famous. It kind of strikes me as a bit odd that he would argue this because it's completely presuppositional and there's nothing you can do to make it otherwise. Where he says the mind is non-extended, whereas the body is extended, and so there's a distinction. But that's just presups. It kind of perplexes me that Descartes even proposed such an argument because he was all about being a foundationalist. Overall, I would say if you like philosophy, read the book. And if you enjoy really fancy writing style, it is very elegantly written, then read the book. But don't expect to hear too many new things if you're familiar with philosophy already. The next book is Why the Germans Do It Better. And this book is written by like a British/German journalist. And the book goes over like a little bit of German history and then a lot of like journalism on modern German policy and the political issues inside Germany. And you also get a little bit of German culture as well. But let's get into some of the ideas from this book. So one thing the book talks about is how German history has impacted the German mindset to this day. Obviously, what happened in the past has not gone away as of yet. And even to this day, you can get in trouble. There are laws that are still enacted if you write certain things in Germany. So the author does talk about that a little bit and how that shaped the German mindset. He argues, which I think is an interesting argument, that Germans have to be better because they can't rely on their past. There's nothing for them to go back to. There's only something for them to go forward to, which I think is an interesting idea. He also talks about the East and West Germany and how Merkel and Putin were both in East Germany during the fall. I think Putin was the Stasi agent. And Merkel was going from East Germany to the West. Also talks about how the NSA was wiretapping Angela Merkel's cell phone and how he made the claim in the book, I didn't fact check it, but that the only country that America has a no spy agreement with was Germany because of this incident. Angela Merkel wasn't happy about it. And he makes a really interesting argument on top of all that about how Germany reunified better than other countries that were previously split, comparing it obviously North and South Korea, in America, and so on and so forth. There are a few countries that are comparable. So going out from the history, he goes into some modern policy issues. For example, the nuclear energy policy and the state subsidizing of nuclear energy. The border issue, he kind of steelmans Angela Merkel's position on it that people don't like when Germany has strong borders, and so they don't really have a choice. They can't have strong borders because they get nervous about it. Things he kind of steelmans like what is maybe the SPD's position a lot. He also talks about the COVID policies and how Germany's responses to the COVID policies were better than the UK's. I think the UK had an above average death rate despite the fact that they had the vaccines 1 or 2 weeks earlier. And people in Germany were kind of shocked at this. And then maybe one thing where he kind of critiques Germany a little bit more and is maybe a little bit less biased on is the German financial sector. The German financial sector is not very good. I think Deutsche Bank lost $2 billion in a day on derivatives. There's been a lot of issues with the German financial sector. And he also talks about how Germany has a green policy, but then when it comes to the automotive industry, they don't have a green policy. It's like, he said it's like the issue of guns for America. Germany's gun bill, or like Second Amendment, is their cars. Everybody has 2 or 3. That's kind of the joke. So overall, the book was not like super informative, and it was a lot based off of his opinions on things. It wasn't like a bunch of facts being dumped on you, which is what I was looking for. But if you maybe have a slight interest in getting into the modern issues of Germany, then you can read that book. But other than that, you could pretty much ignore that book. Now, the next book is Atomic Habits. I'm not a big fan of the book. I'm not a big fan of self-help books like this. I made a list before where there's about like 10 or 12 self-help books, all about habits. Almost all of them say the same thing. But I will say some good things about this book. So I do like some of the ideas inside this book. I did like, for example, the improving by 1% day over day. That's an interesting idea. That's fine. Pairing habits with things that you do automatically already to reinforce the habits. That's, I guess, solid. I do like that he said that people who are excellent at things, usually it boils down to just how much boredom you can tolerate. I think that's a great idea, right? A lot of people think that getting good at something means you're passionate at it, or at least you're only passionate at it. But getting good at something also means you can tolerate boredom. Because even I get bored of like reading books or doing math or writing. At some point, I do get bored of these things, and you have to persevere, right? So I do like that he talks about that. But man, a lot of the things in here, like overall, are very, like if you've taken like one psychology class, you probably already know like 75% of the content inside this book. And if you've read like 2 self-help books, then you probably already know almost everything inside this book, man. It's not, it's overhyped, right? I made a video where I talked about this book being overhyped, so I won't say much more about it. Now, to end on a note of disappointment, unfortunately, a world safe for democracy, liberal internationalism, and the crisis of global order. I thought this book was going to be amazing. I thought it was going to be great. I thought there was going to be tons of data cited in here. I thought there was going to be discussions about the different types of businesses that China, Russia, and America are setting up and how they shape global order, right? Because America, what they do is they set up businesses that then follow like American laws or regulations, or sometimes international laws or regulations that they set up. And that shapes kind of the global environment. Whereas China kind of sets up their own businesses nowadays. And if they keep continuing to do this, we'll have to adjust our standards more towards the Chinese standards. But I thought he was going to talk about all of this. He doesn't mention any of that. He basically tells you, like he goes over like basically Wilsonian and Rooseveltian internationalism, right? Which if you're familiar with international affairs in general, this is already really basic to you. And he doesn't even go into like the nitty-gritty of it. He just talks about its existence. He doesn't talk too much about the Cold War, and he doesn't even talk that much about America's role in shaping these. I will say where he did do some good stuff is he did mention, for example, the number of arbitrations year over year between countries has gone up, which means the kind of international institutions that we've set up for these kinds of things to happen has been working. You do want to see like legal proceedings going up between countries year over year. That's the purpose of it. The number of non-governmental organizations and the number of intergovernmental organizations have gone up in terms of like cooperation between countries has gone up year over year. He does mention that. He also does mention that at one point, I think it was right after World War I, the number of democracies sunk down to 8. I think there's only 8 of them. But now I think it's like 30 or 40. It's pretty strong again. And ideally, it's going to continue to go up. And I do think he does an adequate job of mentioning the idea that, like in the title, A World Safe for Democracy, it's not that we want democracies to be spread, it's that we want to have a world that is itself safe for democracy. He also actually, I'll give him this too, he talks about how people have used democracy for imperialism, right? So like international liberalism has been used to engage in imperialism, especially through soft power, which is true. He doesn't make counter arguments for it. He just says that there's ways to do it better. Kind of like where people will say like, there's unethical capitalism, but you can do ethical capitalism, like ethical consumption is what it's called. But he doesn't really argue against it. He just says, yeah, that happens. Let's do something different. Overall, this book is like a 6 out of 10, especially because he repeats himself a lot. Like in the last chapter of the book, he was still like explaining what international liberalism is. But he has a chapter dedicated to that, so I don't know why he was talking about it again. Yeah, not a good book, and it's an expensive book as well. I think this was like a $40 book. Do not get this book, I would say, unless you really want to read a bad book. So those are the last like 4 books I read. I don't know what that puts me at, like 56 out of 1,000 or something. I'm not sure. I have some other books I'm reading, but with that being said, recommend me some books. Again, I bought more books recently that some of you recommended me, and I will get to them. But with that being said, guys, okay, bye-bye.